The Derek Chauvin trial for the death of George Floyd concluded this week. The jury reached a verdict, and specifically they convicted him of all 3 charges. In this video, I basically want to go over 3 things. First, I want to go over what the jury needed to conclude in order to reach that decision. Second, I want to talk about some of the commentary and critiques that have followed the verdict. And finally, I want to go over what we can expect to come up next, because it's not exactly over even though he has been convicted on all charges. Coming up on Legal Bytes. Hey everyone, welcome to Legal Bytes. I'm Alyte, I'm a lawyer, and on this channel we explain the law one bite at a time. So before I get into it, this week we just crossed over the threshold for 2,800 subscribers, and I'm super excited about it. We are so close to getting to 3,000 subscribers. So if you're watching this and you enjoy this kind of content and you want to see more stuff like this, we would love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you can join us and help us reach 3,000. We're so close. Doing that would be one of the biggest ways that you can support us if you enjoy our stuff. Anyway, let's get on with it. So first, let's start with what the jury needed to conclude in order to convict Derek Chauvin on all charges. Let's start with what those charges were in the first place. First, we had second-degree murder, specifically felony murder. Next, we had third-degree murder. And finally, we had second-degree manslaughter. Now, although there were technically only 3 charges in front of them, they really had to come to a 4th conclusion as well, and that question was on third-degree assault. So let's go into each one of those. In this case, the second-degree murder charge was on the basis of felony murder. Felony murder basically exists where the defendant is in the act of committing or attempting to commit a dangerous felony, and in the process, someone dies. The death can be a co-conspirator, it can be a bystander, or it can be a police officer responding to the felony. The idea is that by committing or attempting to commit a dangerous felony, the defendant is putting other people's lives at risk, and so they should be held responsible for those deaths if they result from it, even if they didn't necessarily intend for those deaths to happen. Most, if not all, states have a felony murder rule, but most states specify which types of felonies can result in a felony murder charge. It usually is a handful of crimes like arson, kidnapping, robbery, often rape too. So that's the majority of states. What's different about Minnesota's felony murder rule is that they have a much broader view as to what counts as a felony under the felony murder rule, and that includes assault. Most other states do not include assault as a possible felony that can be used for a felony murder charge. And that's because if you think about it, all murders or manslaughters, generally speaking, are going to involve some kind of an assault. And just for clarification, an assault is an unlawful touching. It's where the defendant touches the victim without the victim's consent, and where that touching causes the victim harm. So by including assault in the felony murder rule, Minnesota kind of blurs the lines between manslaughter and murder 2 and murder 3. But as strange as that law is in Minnesota, it is the law regardless. So for second-degree murder, here's what the jury had to find in this case. They had to find that Derek Chauvin committed a felony assault, and they had to find that that assault caused George Floyd's death. For the felony assault aspect, we were looking at third-degree assault. Under Minnesota law, third-degree assault basically consists of 2 things: the assault, as I defined it earlier, and it had to cause substantial bodily harm. Because felony assault wasn't charged separately from felony murder, basically what we're looking at is a substantial bodily harm, basically meaning George Floyd's death. So let's turn then to third-degree murder. Looking at third-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant was engaging in an eminently dangerous act and that he showed that he was doing it with reckless disregard for human life. The potentially eminently dangerous act in question here was arguably the knee on the neck. This is where testimony by bystanders really comes in. Their testimony had to convince the jury that Derek Chauvin was being consciously indifferent to the potential loss of life that he was risking by putting his knee on the neck. And there are several different points that the jury could have been looking at for this. It may have been just the fact of putting him in the prone position to begin with. Or it could have been the fact that Derek Chauvin did not roll Mr. Floyd onto his side once they had subdued him. Or it could have also been the fact that Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck while he was in the prone position after he was already subdued. The jury also may have taken into account the video footage taken by bystanders as well as by police officers' body cams. All of that footage shows that bystanders were asking Derek Chauvin to release some of his pressure off of George Floyd. It also shows some of the other officers questioning whether he should have been put onto his side as opposed to in the prone position. All of that could suggest a conscious indifference to the potential risks to George Floyd, despite the communications that are being made around him. Finally, there's second-degree manslaughter. There, the prosecution had to show beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin caused George Floyd's death, and in doing so, that Derek Chauvin created an unreasonable risk and consciously took a chance of causing death or great bodily harm. So basically this was looking at whether there were any other reasonable alternatives that could have diminished the risk of harm to George Floyd and that wouldn't have made the situation any less safe for the officers or for George Floyd or for anyone else. If those alternatives existed at the time, then that could show that he was creating an unreasonable risk. One of the things that the prosecution was arguing for was the fact of putting George Floyd in the prone position as opposed to rolling him on his side. And that may very well have been a relevant factor for the jury. But ultimately, it seemed like this case really came down to two main issues: causation and unreasonable force. For causation, I'm specifically talking about whether or not Derek Chauvin caused George Floyd's death. As we all know, there were many circumstances that possibly contributed to George Floyd's death. He apparently had a heart condition. He also apparently had illicit drugs in his system, so he could have had a drug overdose. There was also the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning, given the fact that he was nearby the exhaust of a car. Now, the prosecution never needed to show that Derek Chauvin was the cause of George Floyd's death. There could be a number of causes that actually led to George Floyd's death. What the prosecution needed to prove was whether Derek Chauvin's use of force was a substantial factor leading to George Floyd's death. Basically, that means that of all the things that ultimately did cause George Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin's use of force needed to be one of them. And more than that, basically you need to come to the conclusion that if there was no force used by Derek Chauvin on George Floyd that day, George Floyd would have lived to see another day. That's known as but-for causation, because it basically means but for the use of force by Derek Chauvin, George Floyd would have lived. Another way that lawyers often look at this is with what's called the eggshell skull rule. Basically, there's this concept in the law that you take your victim as they come. Basically, that means that a perpetrator of a crime can't benefit from the fact that they just so happened to target someone who was already in a weak state. The law does not want to reward people for doing that. So it really doesn't matter how weak or vulnerable that the victim was before the perpetrator committed the crime against them. The victim could have stage 4 cancer, a massive heart condition, a really bad case of COVID, and be a hemophiliac. And if the defendant, without really that much force, ended up killing them, the defendant is still responsible. So as far as causation is concerned, what I really want to hammer out here is the fact that in order for Derek Chauvin to be convicted on the causation element, really it's not necessary to show that he was the only cause, only that he was a substantial factor. And when we're talking about a case like this that has multiple factors, you really rely on medical expert testimony. And really both sides have an equal opportunity to find experts to analyze one way or another. In this case, the prosecution had, I think, 3 medical experts, and the defense, I believe, had 1. All 3 witnesses for the prosecution labeled this case as a medical homicide. Now, medical homicide is different than a legal homicide. In the medical sense, it basically just means that the person died as a result of volitional acts by another human being. So sometimes those two terms can be confused. But the reason why that determination as to medical homicide really matters here is for causation. Even though medical homicide doesn't necessarily mean homicide in the legal sense, it does have a huge bearing on causation. Basically, it means that all 3 of those medical experts for the prosecution determined that the death of George Floyd was caused by another human being. And that human being in question in this case was Derek Chauvin. So if 3 different medical experts make that determination, it is possible that a jury can reliably use that to determine that Derek Chauvin's use of force was a substantial factor in George Floyd's death. And it is important to note that one of those medical experts, the medical examiner for Hennepin County, made that decision without having seen any of the video footage of the incident. So the likelihood of bias by that footage is pretty much eliminated. Now, on the other side, the medical expert that testified for the defense didn't come to that same conclusion. He did not determine that the manner of death was a medical homicide, but he also did not determine that it was due to any kind of an overdose or a suicide or any other sort of factor. Basically, what he landed on was that it was undetermined. And that's fine, but if you're trying to open the door for reasonable doubt to creep in, the defense really needs something, I think, more than that. Generally speaking, if someone's going to release one theory, they want to be able to replace it with another. So because the medical expert that testified for the defense couldn't really come to a specific conclusion, his testimony wasn't really that effective in my opinion. So the other main question here was whether or not there was unreasonable or excessive force. And that's because of the assault element. You see, in order for an assault to be an assault, it has to be an unlawful touching. When it comes to the police, they are allowed to use a certain amount of force, but it has to be reasonable force. As soon as a police officer uses unreasonable force on someone, then it becomes an assault. So the question came down to whether Derek Chauvin's actions were essentially what a reasonable officer would do. This is where use of force experts came in, as well as other officers from the Minneapolis Police Department testifying as to the training of these officers. For example, whether it was in their training to place people into the prone position, or whether to keep them in the prone position. On top of that, there were questions as to what was the training for rendering medical aid, for example. At what point should Derek Chauvin and the other officers involved on the scene have rendered medical aid to George Floyd? What was their responsibility in rendering aid? And finally, the jury had to consider all of the information that Derek Chauvin had going into the incident. And this is one area that I think that the defense attorney did pretty well. In his closing argument, he really tried to widen the scope of events that Derek Chauvin had leading up to the occurrence, and that was to give more context. For example, he talked about how Derek Chauvin was not actually the first officer to arrive, he was actually arriving as backup for other officers. That usually is an indication that there's some sort of trouble on the scene and potentially a higher risk or a higher threat of violence. There also was the fact that Derek Chauvin knew that there was a suspicion of drugs involved, which meant that there was a substantial probability that George Floyd's actions could have been a bit unpredictable. On top of that, there was George Floyd's size. He apparently was a pretty large man. And there's the fact that when Derek Chauvin first arrived on the scene, George Floyd was refusing to get into the car and the officers were really struggling to try to get him in there. But the fact is that these occurrences are in fact fluid. And the prosecution did hammer in that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes. And despite the objections by the crowd, despite the objections of other officers, they repeated several times, he didn't get up, he didn't let up. And the question for the jury here had to be whether or not a reasonable police officer would have done the same thing. When you consider the fact that pretty much the entire Minneapolis Police Department testified against Derek Chauvin, that really weighs heavily in favor of the idea that he was really not acting like a reasonable police officer. So all in all, I really think that there was evidence to support the jury's verdict. But I know that there have been plenty of comments and critiques by tons and tons of other people following the verdict. One of those critiques is the reasonable doubt aspect as to causation. But like I said, there were 3 medical experts for the prosecution that all said that George Floyd probably died of a medical homicide. And for the other side, the best that the medical expert could do was say that it was inconclusive. And think about for a second the fact that one of the medical experts for the prosecution was the medical examiner for Hennepin County. He reached the conclusions that he did about George Floyd's death really before the media firestorm started, before he saw any kind of videos of George Floyd's death, before he saw any of the body cam footage, before any sort of allegations were charged. So really, if there's any expert that's to be trusted most out of all 4 of them, it would probably be the medical examiner. Now, another criticism that's been voiced about the Chauvin trial is the issue about assault. There have been those that have argued that Derek Chauvin never intended to commit an assault and that therefore he could not have been found by the jury to have committed a felony assault and therefore couldn't have been found to have committed a felony murder for murder too. Now, something about the crime of assault is that it's not a specific intent crime. It's a general intent crime. And there's a big difference between those. Specific intent basically means that you need to specifically intend a particular result. For general intent crimes, you really don't need to be consciously thinking about what it is that you're trying to do at all. All you really need is to have conscious control over your body. So sometimes it's easier to explain a concept by showing what it isn't. In this case, what would lead to someone not meeting the element of intent for purposes of an assault? Well, basically that would be if somebody had some sort of a neurological disorder, for example, that they couldn't control their limbs. They had no control of their limbs, and so they ended up smacking someone and causing harm. There's no way that they could have intended that, right? Another example would be if someone had chronic sleepwalking and they tended to sleepwalk and do all kinds of crazy things in their sleep. If they're completely unconscious when they're committing a certain act, they can't have the required consciousness in order to have met the element of general intent. But where you have someone that throws their fist in the air, and they may not have intended to actually hit someone. Maybe they intended just to scare someone. If they ended up hitting that person and causing great bodily harm, they're responsible for that. And that's because assault is a general intent crime. And finally, I know that there has been a lot of concern about the jury making the decisions that they did because of certain concerns about rioting or harm to them. I did see a report that one of the witnesses that testified for the defense ended up having some sort of pig's blood and I think even a pig's head thrown at their front door. So I don't want to belittle the potential threats that people may have felt by being on the jury. However, unless some sort of a juror were to come forward and actually say openly that the only reason why they convicted was because of those kinds of concerns, we really have to assume, or at least presume, that the jury was convicting based on the evidence that was on the record. And personally, because I think that there is enough evidence out there to convict him, I really think that it would be irresponsible to say otherwise, unless there was some evidence that came out that various members of the jury actually did make that decision that they otherwise would have acquitted. So while it is totally possible that that was a pretty substantial concern for the jury, we really can't assume that that's the only reason why they came to that conclusion. So now that he's been convicted, what's next? First up, Derek Chauvin has to be sentenced, and I'm pretty sure that's supposed to happen on, I think, June 10th. He's looking at a maximum sentence of 40 years for second-degree murder, 25 years for third-degree murder, and 10 years for second-degree manslaughter. The sentencing guidelines in Minnesota say that the minimum for the second-degree murder charge is 12.5 years. Now, because all of these convictions are for a single act, it's for the one knee on the neck, right? The 40 years and the 25 years and the 10 years kind of get stacked within one another. If the convictions were for a series of different acts, they would be added together. But in this case, we're looking at a maximum of 40 years total. Now, normally the sentencing would be determined by the jury. But in this case, Derek Chauvin has waived his right to have a jury determine that. So in this case, Judge Cahill, the judge who presided over the case, will determine Derek Chauvin's sentencing. Now, people have talked about the possibility of Derek Chauvin appealing his verdict. There are basically two bases that he might be looking at. The first is the issue of the third-degree murder charge. I'll try to condense this part because I know that this video is getting a little bit long, but basically there's another case that's already in the appellate system that is challenging the interpretation of the third-degree murder charge in a way that would affect the applicability of third-degree murder to Derek Chauvin's case. Personally, I think that an appeal on this issue would be actually kind of futile. And that's because even if he were to get the conviction for third-degree murder overturned, he still was convicted of second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. So ultimately, he probably would be spending the same amount of time in jail. Now, the other basis for appeal is potentially the remarks that were made by possibly President Biden, but more likely Representative Maxine Waters, on the actual trial while the trial was ongoing. I'm sure you're aware Representative Maxine Waters attended a protest towards the end of the trial and made some comments to the media that many find, let's just say, controversial. And the issue there is that her comments could have possibly affected the mindset of the jury. Basically, these are her comments.
Well, we're looking for a guilty verdict. We're looking for a guilty verdict. And we're looking to see if all of the talk that took place and has been taking place after they saw what happened to George Floyd, if nothing does not happen, then we know that we've got to not only stay in the street, but we've got to fight for justice. But I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that will say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
And not just manslaughter, right? I mean...
Oh, no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder. I don't know whether it's in the first degree, but as far as I'm concerned, it's first degree murder.
Congresswoman, what happens if we do not get what you just told? What should the people do? What should protesters on the street do?
I didn't hear you.
What happens?
What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street. And we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
So because trial was ongoing and because the jury was not sequestered, the defense counsel actually moved for a mistrial on the following day. Judge Cahill ended up denying it and moving on with trial, but he did indicate that Representative Waters' comments could have possibly given him a basis for appeal.
Well, I'll give you that Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal. I'm aware that Congresswoman Waters was talking specifically about this trial and about the unacceptability of anything less than a murder conviction and talk about being confrontational, but you can submit the press articles about that. This goes back to what I've been saying from the beginning. I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch and our function. I think if they want to give their opinions, they should do so in a respectful and in a manner that is consistent with their oath to the Constitution, to respect the co-equal branch of government. Their failure to do so, I think, is abhorrent, but I don't think it has prejudiced us with additional material that would prejudice this jury. They have been told not to watch the news. I trust they are following those instructions and that there is not in any way a prejudice to the defendant beyond the articles that we're talking specifically about the facts of this case.
Now, as a reminder, from the very beginning, the judge admonished the jury to stay away from any news reportings or any kind of social media updates about the case. And generally speaking, the law does presume that jurors are going to follow those instructions. So really, in order for this issue to be successful on appeal, several things would need to happen. First, they would need to know that jurors actually knew about Maxine Waters' statements before they made the determination for the guilty verdicts. Second, it would have to be known that Maxine Waters' comments actually had an impact on the juror's decision. And at this point, at the time of recording this video, we really don't have any information to show either of those. So despite how incendiary those comments may have been, and despite how distasteful Judge Cahill found those comments to be in terms of respecting the judicial branch, I still don't know that they would necessarily lead to a successful appeal by Derek Chauvin. Anyway, aside from those potential appeals, now the prosecution is also turning to the 3 different officers who were on the scene with Derek Chauvin when George Floyd died. All of them have been charged with aiding and abetting Derek Chauvin in murdering George Floyd. Now, each of those cases has to be looked at on its own, and that would probably be the subject of another video. Anyway, I think this video may have been a little bit long, but what are your thoughts? Do you think that Derek Chauvin was properly convicted? Do you agree with the jury's decision to convict Derek Chauvin on all charges? Or do you think that they should have acquitted him on 1 or more charges? Do you think that the jury was impacted by quote-unquote mob rule? Let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting and informative, and if you did, we would love it if you'd hit the like button. It really does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And like I said, if you really want to support us and help us get to 3,000 subscribers, we're almost there. I would love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you can find out when the next video is uploaded and you can see more content just like this. Anyway, see you in the next video.